Greetings and welcome to this latest installation of the Senturus Knowledge Series. Today, we're pleased to be presenting to you on the topic of how to set up row-level security in Power BI, featuring a demo and discussion and of static and dynamic security implementation in Power BI. Our agenda today, after some quick introductions, we'll get into the meat of the presentation featuring row-level security in the context of an overall Power BI deployment. We'll feature some demos showing off static and dynamic row-level security, as well as cover some additional security considerations. After which, stick around, we'll do a brief Senturus overview for those of you who may not be familiar with what we offer, give you some great additional free resources, and then we'll wrap up at the end with the always interesting Q&A. I'm pleased to be joined today by my colleague, Steven Volschlager, Vice President here at Senturus. He has an extensive background in BI operation and finance that spans 30 years, during which time he's led numerous business analytics initiatives using Microsoft data tools and has watched the platform evolve from his initial use of version 1 of SQL Server and Microsoft Access. He brings various capabilities and components of the Microsoft BI platform and an understanding of how to best leverage them. He's also responsible for having curated and actually delivering the preponderance of our Power BI training content, which is excellent. My name is Mike Weinhauer. I'm a director here at Senturus, serving a number of different roles, but one of them is the MC of the Knowledge Series webinars. I'm pleased to be here with you today. With that, I'll hand the floor over to Mr. Volschlager for the main part of the presentation. Steve, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Mike, and welcome everyone to today's topic on Power BI row-level security. As Mike said, our kind of outline today is going to give first sort of the context of how row-level security fits within kind of like the overall Power BI security framework, and then do some demos of how to set up row-level security, both at a sort of static level or do a sort of more dynamic version. And then we'll kind of step back and think about some of the sort of how to think about security or sort of broader sort of security planning. So with that, first point to make is if you think about Power BI security, recognize that Power BI is an online SaaS offering built on Azure, and it's got basically two clusters, like a web front end and a back end. So whenever you go to app.powerbi.com to log in, you're actually connecting to their Azure instance of Power BI. And if you choose the premium service, then you can actually purchase sort of dedicated provisioned partitions instances of Azure, so you can have better control over your performance and those sorts of things. And that's not, the security around that is not really a subject of this, but it's certainly something to think about, like how are you securing the communication pipe, those sorts of things. When is data encrypted, when isn't, all important questions to think about. And as part of some of our other sorts of training, we kind of get into those in more detail. But the other important point to make about the infrastructure is it uses Azure Active Directory for account authentication. So similar to using your Office 365 account. And so all the things related to user accounts, security groups, distribution lists apply and can be used when you're setting up row-level security. And there's a good white paper that Microsoft published here. There's a link at the bottom. We'll have it in other resources that kind of goes through some of these sort of basic kind of security elements of Power BI. Next slide. Second thing to think about when you think about security is how the data is stored and how it's moved. So what we're talking about here is a Power BI data set that you're publishing into a workspace on the service. And there's this concept of you can actually either import data into your data set, or you can use DirectQuery, which is basically a connection back to your original source. And whenever you're presenting a visualization, it's going to actually query the original SQL database or whatever the source is to present the information. So the data in that case isn't residing locally within the Power BI data set, it's actually in the source. And there's kind of like two ways, again, thinking about security more broadly. You've got data that's at rest, meaning it's kind of where it's being stored or it's in process, like I'm in the middle of doing a query or something like that. And again, there's sorts of aspects to think about around encryption and that sort of thing. But specific to row level security, we're focusing really on the data at rest. And whether it's import or DirectQuery, the information about the table structure is always stored in that PBX file. It's just that the actual row data, which may or may not be. And as I mentioned, the Power BI uses Active Directory. The service uses Active Directory. So when you're connecting to data sources, when you're setting up the security around that, it uses whatever sort of the connection or login is to that original source system when you're connecting to the data. But once you actually then say share it and post to Power BI and do this row level security, you kind of have to break it out between there's some data sources that don't support row level security and there's some that are capable. So like the data sets, everything you import, that supports it. And for the most part, DirectQuery supports it. And then if you use the on-premise gateway, then that can also sometimes enforce row level security on sources like SQL Server and stuff like that. So we'll focus today on some of the row level security capable data sources, just stuff we've imported. And I've been mentioning row level security, but it's worth stepping back and saying, well, what is row level security? What does that mean? And it's a security mechanism that filters the records from a table based upon what authorization the user has, what permissions the user has. So the best example is if I've got like a simple table here with 5 records, and I've got a username, and I've got territories associated. So Mike here has, USA and Mexico, and John has just USA, actually has Brazil as well, and Kay has Canada. And that's what all the records are. But if I log in as Mike, it's automatically going to filter the records on that table to only show the records that Mike has permissions to see or that Mike's associated with. Or if I log in as John, then it's going to filter the records so that I can only see those records of data. Or similarly, Kay can only see her Canada record. And that's being done and this was basically introduced in Microsoft SQL Server in 2015, and kind of gives that sort of fine-grained sort of access control that you might want to give to specific users. And it's transparent in the sense that it's built into it's done at the application layer. It's not done at the application layer. It's kind of done at the database level. So if you've got other applications built on top, they'll all can enforce the same row level security. And it gives you a chance to do some centralizing of the logic around which you want to set up your security table or your security permissions. So within that, there's this notion of roles in Power BI. And again, this all goes back for all of you who've been doing Active Directory for years, the notion of role-based security instead of role security groups. And the best practice is to not do it at like an individual email address, like in the example I was showing you, but set up a group. And then and that group plays a role in your organization. So it could be that this group has permissions on a particular geographic region, or this group has permissions on a particular function, whether it's sales or operations or something like that. So the idea is people play roles, and then you can set up your security so they'll filter based on those roles. And Power BI has this special filter built in, which we will see, called the role filter, where you can associate people with those roles. So, an example is project manager, and then you might have people play more than one role. That's okay. You can associate them with more than one if you want to give like a manager permission over things overall. So I've been using, we talked about this term static role filters, and I think the best way really is to dive into an example. So let's see here. If I go to this, okay. So first, just to level set our demonstration, We set this up using the AdventureWorks dataset that's common. It's Microsoft published. It's been used a lot for demos and stuff like that. But it's simple and clear and well set up to support these sorts of examples. And probably a lot of people might be familiar with it already. And my data set that I've set up here is just 2 tables. If I look at my model view, or if I look at my data view, you see I've got an internet sales table. So basically got sales order records, and it's got, it's got the order amount, the cost and the sales order amount and some dates. And then I've also again got a sales territory, and I'll focus on the sales territory group. Got North America, Europe, or Pacific. And then if you look at my data model, we've set up a relationship between those 2 tables. And and it's basically doing a join on sales territory key to join them together. And what that means, if I was to do a report, then it would filter the records on internet sales if I were to say put a slicer on my report and filter by sales territory group. So let's just go through it here. If I were to go into the report view and say I just wanted to create like a little stacked bar chart. So I'll click on stacked bar chart and I'm going to expand it so it's more visible. And I'm just going to add my sales amount. I'll create a measure for sales amount here. So I'll add that. And then I'll also add the sales territory group that I was mentioning. So now you see I've got a report. It gives me sales by North America, by Pacific, by Europe. And the next thing you'd want to do then is say to set up role level security. There's several ways to get to it, but if I'm in my report view and I go to modeling, there's a section here called manage roles and security. Similarly, if I were in the data view here, it's actually on the home tab. This is a security section. So you can get to it from several places. If I just go in here and go to manage roles, and I can create a new role. I'm just going to call this one APAC for Asia Pacific. And then you can basically set your rule, which is I'm going to say that sales territory group equals quote Pacific. And then that should then set, and this is basically just standard DAX expression. So this is a very simple one. And I'm going to hit save. Oh, and then I typed it wrong. Whoops. Uh-oh. Let's go back. Let's see here. Sales territory group equals quote Pacific. And that's because I spelled sales territory group wrong. Actually, let's see, this is a good example. I actually tried to write this expression on fact internet sales. Well, that's actually wrong because that's not a field in that table. So really what I want to do is put it in dim sales territory, which is where that field exists. And I click on the check mark. Now you'll see it accepted it. And now I can actually create 2 more. So I'll create a new one called EU and similar sort of thing. And I'll call this Europe rather than Pacific. And I'll create one more and I'll call it NA for North America. And I'll call it North America. And hit save. So now let's just go back and look at there again. So I've got 3 different roles that I've set up, one for each kind of region. And I've basically specified this sort of DAX expression that will apply a filter to my data. And now, also within Power BI Desktop, which is where we're doing all this work, and actually role level security, I should mention, has to be set up in Power BI Desktop, and then you publish it to the workspace. So this is all done in Desktop and then published out. So if I click on View As, actually if I go back first to my report, and now if I go to the modeling, I click View As, it'll allow you to see what it would look like if I logged in as a particular role. So if everything worked well, if I log in as APAC here, you'll see now it's actually going to filter that report. So anyone who's been associated with the APAC role, this is what they're going to see. Similarly, if I did the EU role, I'm going to see that they just see the Europe data. And this is actually good for checking to make sure you set up your filters correctly and they're operating the way that you want them to. So if I do North America, that one worked as well. So now I've got my security set up and working in Power BI Desktop. So now that I've done that, next step I want to do is publish this out so I can start sharing it. So to do that is just standard publish. So if I go to my home tab, I click on the publish, and I save my changes. And then I'm logged in, and it's going to give me a list of all the workspaces that I have permissions to publish to. And we're just going to do it to our lab environment. And now it's just it should be pretty quick because it's a small file. It's going to publish that out into the Power BI service. So now that I have role level, that's set up. Now the next step is to go into the Power BI service. And I'm logged in as my instructor account, which is what I publish as. And you'll see that here it is. Here's the new data set that we just created. And also here's the report. And since I'm the instructor, I can see I have actually permissions on all three. But if you go back into the workspace here to the data set, the next step in setting up the security is then to go associate users with those roles that you created. So I'll go here and I'll click, there's a little ellipses here next to the data set, and there's a section called security. And under APAC, I can click on APAC and I can choose a user who's got an account on our AD service, our Office 365 account. So I got pbi.student01, and I'll add and save. And then let's add student 02 to Europe, add and save, and student 3 to North America, and hit save. And now those are there. Now also it's so faint and hard to see, but there's actually the same sort of view as option here, these little ellipses. So I can test as role, and now it's going to show me now what the report looks like if I had that role. And so I can actually toggle here and see what it would look like as Europe, and see what it would look like as North America, and apply. So now I see that I've got it set up. I also see that I've also now associated with particular right users, and so that's it. Now it's all set up. And if I were actually to go over, and I've got another machine here where I'm logged in as PBI student 01, and actually it might make me log out first. So let's see here. Yeah, there it is. And I go to content. First of all, this is the next point to make. I'll show you this first, but I'll make another point. So now you see I'm student 01, and I logged in as student 01, and this is the report it gave me, just the Pacific region. There's one other little nuance here, though, is when you're setting up your workspaces, and so this is like the workspace, you grant access to people to the workspace. And here I've made student 1 and student 2, I've given them viewer permissions on the workspace. And you have other options here. But a point to note is that the role level security is only applied for people who have viewer permissions. So if you've got people in this workspace that have higher level permissions like contributor, member, admin, they're going to be able to see all of the data, even if you tried to set up those roles and associate them with the roles. So that's actually something to keep in mind. This is very much targeted towards those sort of viewer consumer roles within Power BI. And you also then have to be careful, because if you give people permission to download the data set, say like here, I can download the PBX file or analyze in Excel, or if I download the file, then they'll be able to get to it, they'll be able to see all of the data. So again, you got to make sure when you're setting up the broader security and access privileges, you set that up the way you want. Okay, so and then the next point to make is we've done this now, and you look at that and you say, gosh, that's actually a lot of maintenance. You know, I have to manually set up the roles. I manually associate them in the service. You know, but I've already got those sort of security infrastructure in place. Is there kind of maybe a more efficient way to do it? So pretty quickly, we recommend moving from the sort of static example to like more of a dynamic example, I'm calling it, where you've got a security table set up to do the joins and the filtering. And that if you guys have already got installations around your organization, you've been doing data and data analytics, and you've already set these security tables up, you can probably going to want to make use of them for this as well. So, and in that case, there's a couple DAX functions to be aware of that you'll make use of. There's called username and user principal name. And they both kind of basically return the username of the person who's logged in, and they just do it in different formats depending upon how you want to use it. So it's either username is domain/username, or user principal name is just their email address. And again, since whenever someone, in order to access the Power BI service, I have to log in, Power BI knows the username of everyone who's logged in and who's trying to view the report. And this function then is available for you, not only for row level security, but other things you might want to use that for with your DAX in all of your reporting. So let's look at an example of that. So here, basically, it's the same thing. I've got the same sales territory, internet sales tables, but I also added another table here called the user territory, where I've associated users with the territories. And again, the primary key I'm doing a join on my territory table is this sales territory key. And I see North America is associated with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on and so forth, Europe. So did the similar sort of setup here to associate my users. So I basically associated student 1 with those, and student 2 with, I think that was Europe, and student 3 with Asia Pacific. And then in my model, I need to add that sort of join to the relationship. So I need to add that relationship. And now that I have that relationship, then it'll apply these filters all the way across. So whenever I want to, on my report, filter on a particular user account, it's going to filter all the data. And you can see that as an example. I set up a report here, and here's just a list of all of the records in that sales territory table, and like which student I associated with. I didn't overlap any students, kind of like one-to-one, but you could, like I said, have multiple, a person could be associated with multiple territories if you wanted. And there's, like I said, there's this DAX expression here. And I created one called current user principal name is equal to the user principal name, that function. And that's actually what's displayed on this card. And I'm logged in currently with my machine, and I've got a big interest in Roman history, so Libertas and freedom. So that's kind of like the username that I logged into. But when we publish this out to Power BI, this will show us the username of whoever's logged in. And then, I can filter it. You can see if I got PBI student, this is what they're going to see, and so on and so forth. Now, set up role level security in this case is actually very similar. It's basically the same as we did before. Or I'm going to create one role here, or very similar in terms of making use of the DAX. Let me just make sure I get my formula correct here. Okay, so I'm going to create a new role, and I'm going to call it user territory. If I could spell, user territory. And I'm going to put it on this table. And I'm going to say, where'd it go? user account was the name of the field, equals user principal name. And let's just check, did that work? Okay, so I've got my field user account, and basically what this is saying is, based upon who's logged in, if I'm logged in as student 1, then I'm going to filter all the records to whatever permissions in my security table that person has permissions to see. And just make sure I spelled it right. Okay, so same thing. Now I'm going to go ahead and go out and publish this. To the Power BI service, to our lab. Okay, and now if I go back there, we should, if I refresh this, there should be now, it added this sort of my data set again here. And the same thing, I'm going to go into security to set the permissions. I've got that role that I created called user territory. I mentioned that you could use email addresses, but you can also use Power BI groups. So we actually have a group here called the PBI class, and all of our students are a member of that class. So, and that's really best practice, AD 10 basics, right? Is use roles and groups rather than individual email addresses when you're doing this. So I've set up, which of course, if you're working in a large organization, means you probably have to collaborate with whoever the administrators are of your Office 365 account and stuff like that to set this up. I set that, and then if I go to my ellipsis test as role, and I select a person, pbi.student01, it should apply the filter across. So there you see it. So if it's student 1, the only records that are being displayed from this table are theirs. Those others aren't even visible. And my chart here is being filtered to only show North America. Similarly, all my slicers are also filtered. So the whole thing, all the data is being filtered because of those relationships that we set up here in our model between user territory and these tables. So now, like I said, if I were actually to go over to my other machine where I'm logged in as student 1 and refresh the data, and I look at this report, and again, notice this person only has viewer capabilities. So I click on data sets. Those data sets that I published aren't even visible. That person doesn't even doesn't see them. All they have permissions on is, as a viewer, is the reports. So now if I go into my dynamic one, if everything worked well, there you go, student 1. Similarly, I've got my other machine here. You can see student 2 here, another Greek goddess or Roman goddess. If I go to this and refresh the data, and I'm now logged in, and this one is student 2, and you can see what this person sees. So I think one of the questions that got posted was, can you use AD security groups? And we just demonstrated that absolutely you can. That's what I just did. Because if you noticed, when I set my role here, back here, if I go back to on the data set, when I set it up here on security, why is my computer freezing? On security, this is a group. This is actually an Office 365 group, but it could be a AD security group as well. So, and that is actually the recommended approach, like I was saying. So those are 2 examples of row level security. Now, odds are, if you're a larger organization, you have a more complex hierarchy you're trying to implement between that, besides those sort of basics. And the principles are exactly the same. It really comes down to a more complex DAX function for your filter. And there's sort of different examples that we could do around that, which I don't think we necessarily need to go through here because we've always illustrated the comp. But you can imagine a DAX function that has an or there's also, even if you've got your table set up that's kind of recursive, so like it's got a person, this salesperson, and they report to this man. It says reports to, and then the same table has another record with the manager, and that person reports up. So you've kind of built a hierarchy within it. You can make use of what's called the path function within DAX to trace through that hierarchy. So and I've seen 6, 7 levels of hierarchy people are trying to do with this, or even more than just user. There could be more dimensions by which you want to apply your filter, and all that comes back to how you kind of construct this sort of function. So with that, you've probably already seen some of the limitations of row-level security, right? It doesn't necessarily answer the question, who can see which reports, right? You're kind of controlling that through the access in the to the workspace and that sort of thing. So this is really just about how it's applying filters to the data within those reports. And as I mentioned, it's kind of applied really just basically if people have the viewer sort of role. And also, if you have to be careful, because if people have access to the data set, or they download it or access a different way, they can potentially get around it. And the sort of, whether it's this approach or any sort of security you're doing on your platform, there's always this question of how can I maintain those permissions of my security table and keep it up to date and accurate. And that's partly an operational sort of question, but definitely a reason to go to having some sort of security table, this sort of dynamic sort of approach. Suppose this sort of more simple. You might have a simple solution for static, but pretty quickly you're going to want to get to sort of maintenance. And to the extent that your organization supports it, again, pushing that into the Active Directory groups is a good way to go. Let me see. And then there's things to think about. Row-level security is a piece of your overall sort of security framework. And when you're sort of planning this and thinking it through, first steps are, okay, well, which users need access to what information? So, what are your security roles? What are you trying to, which information is critical, and how critical is it that we prevent the, restrict this information? So certainly in the planning design phase and thinking it through, those are sort of fundamental sort of questions. And it fits into what's your overall data governance approach to Power BI, which isn't just security. We were talking about where is the data going to reside, and we're going to present, how are we going to architect our overall sort of data structure, and how are we going to certify data sets and make sure that we've got a single source of truth and all those sorts of things. This is kind of a piece of that sort of broader planning design puzzle to be thinking through, as well as there's a lot of performance sort of impacts, right, and things to think about. And that gets back to import versus direct query, and how you're having the data, and then how do you optimize for performance. And if I've set up direct query, then you've got all sorts of things that can affect it, like network latency and those sorts of things. And you want to make sure then that your query that gets sent to the source is a restricted data set and a smaller data set and things like that. So need to think beyond just security to overall sort of performance design and optimization as well. And that gets back to where we'll implement security. We're doing an example here where it's all in Power BI, but a lot of you have data warehouses where you've got security already built into the back end, or you're using analysis services, and maybe row-level security isn't the right way to go. Maybe you want to make use of those in your design instead. And like I said, all these things, it comes back to operational. Once I built it, how can I make sure that it's easy to maintain and control and update and those sorts of things? all important considerations when you're thinking about your overall security and data governance planning. With that kind of overview, kind of just talk about some additional resources and then hand it over to Mike, and then maybe have a few questions that I see are kind of popping up on the chat. So just to point out that this is just one in a series. Senturus offers training courses and kind of like the entire piece of the platform of Power BI. We also offer mentoring sessions. If you want to have follow-up questions, you just want to do a one-on-one sort of quick mentoring session. Often with security, it gets into very specific questions about particular sort of things people need. And so it kind of moves beyond these sort of general discussions. You need to dive into the sort of specific scenario that you're trying to wrestle with, especially with some of the sort of DAX formation, and it also gets back to how do I structure my data model optimally to support this sort of filtering. So modeling is an important piece of this as well. And we continue to publish articles on our website, references, sources you can go to. And like I said, as you're thinking broader about your enterprise rollout and sort of administration, how you're going to do it, also, we're there to help and talk through those sorts of questions. So with that, I will hand it back over to Mike.
Great, thanks, Steve. Yeah, stick around, everyone. There's a lot of great questions in the question log that we're going to get to after just a couple of slides here. So don't hang up, as it were. And Steve, maybe while you're driving the deck here, you can peruse that real quick. It looks like you've been keeping an eye on it, and there's one also in the chat window, by the way. But a few quick words about Senturus in case you're unfamiliar with us. We are the authority in business intelligence. All we do is concentrate our expertise on BI all day, every day, with a depth of knowledge across the entire BI stack. We're known for providing clarity from the chaos of complex business requirements, disparate data sources, and constantly moving targets. We made a name for ourselves because of our strength at bridging the gap between IT and business users. We deliver solutions that give organizations access to reliable analysis-ready data across the organization so they can quickly and easily get answers at the point of impact in the decisions they make and the actions they take. We offer a full spectrum of BI services, as Steve alluded to before, everything from creating dashboards, reports, and visualizations to back-end data preparation and modern data warehousing, handling hybrid BI environments like migration, security, complex security, and cloud versus on-prem, et cetera. We even offer software to enable bimodal BI and platform migrations, and we have expertise on demand for you, as well as complete training and mentoring across Cognos, Power BI, and Tableau. We're so confident in our team and our methodology that we back our projects with a 100% money-back guarantee that's unique in the industry. We've also been doing this for a while, coming up on 2 decades. We work across the spectrum from Fortune 500 clients to the mid-market. Many of those logos you'll no doubt recognize, solving problems across many industries and functional areas ranging from the Office of Finance to sales and marketing, manufacturing, operations, HR, and IT. Our team is both large enough to meet all of your business analytics needs, yet small enough to provide personalized attention. We mentioned earlier that if you head over to, if you want to flip the slide there, Steve, if you visit senturus.com/senturus-resources, you will find all of the great webinars that we have out there, in addition to a ton of other great information. And I was remiss in stating that, leaving out that there will be a recording of this webinar that we always post along with a questions log and a copy of the presentation. Great upcoming events. You can always go to senturus.com/events, and there's a Cognos Framework Manager versus Data Modules event that will be Thursday, June 25th. So same time in a couple of weeks here. Go ahead and register for that. We do offer complete BI training across the 3 different platforms I mentioned before, Cognos, Power BI, and Tableau. Everything from corporate offerings that combine the various modalities and offerings to tailored group sessions, individual to small group mentoring, instructor-led online virtual courses, and self-paced e-learning. So talk to us about how we can help your organization meet all of your training needs. And then finally, before we get to the Q&A, we again recommend that you head over to our site for hundreds of different great free resources, including unbiased product reviews, our tech tips, our fabulous blog, which provides kind of top of mind, up to the minute, very easily digestible information in the business analytics space, product demos, and the aforementioned upcoming events. And with that, we can take the remaining time that we have and dive into some of the questions. So I don't know if you picked up one or two that you want to start with, Steve, or if you want me to start kind of doling them out for you.
Yeah, I got it here. Yeah.
All right.
So several questions here. So let me just pull up my example. Okay. So first question was, will this be sharing recording as well? The answer is yes. Someone pointed out to me that I was setting up to the wrong table that I fixed. Question is, can you do this from a Power BI report server? The answer is yes. The same concepts apply. And there's several questions around AD and Power BI groups. And so yes, you can use this for groups, as I say, but a lot of people, like I said, sometimes that's not so easy to implement because maybe IT restricts it or something like that. You can also get more sophisticated in how you set up this user table. So even though I was doing it to link to the groups, I could do it all through a more sophisticated security table here instead. And I could even add columns to create a hierarchy. So I could have had another column here, which is, group 1 or group 2, or some things like that. Similarly, there's this sort of question about hierarchy. Similar sort of thing. I could have a hierarchy. If I had another table here that had, say, a hierarchy of users and employees, say, and it had who that person reports to as part of the table, and then basically therefore it was recursive and iterative, then I could use the DAX function, the path function, to actually build a path for each user, each employee, and then I could use that as part of my filtering. Let's see. What other sort of questions are there? If you give users viewer access to the data set, I'd have to test it. On some of these, I'd have to really test and make sure I gave you the proper definitive answer. And again, if you give them access to the data set to create reports, I think even at that point, they're going to be able to get around the low-level security, but it's something to be easy for you to test. Other questions here, I'm just going through the list, is row-level security available only for premium? The answer is no. It doesn't require a premium license. It works with the Pro license as well. But you do have to have at least Pro in order to be able to share your reports that you create in Power BI Desktop with others.
We had a question on the chat log about if you import the data using a SQL query instead of individual tables, is it possible to apply RLS to that?
Yes. Well, if you import data using a SQL query, absolutely, because it's basically the same. You go to get data, and I actually imported it from Excel, but I could import it from SQL Server just as easily, and it's exactly the same. I've imported the data, I've got a local instance, and row-level security will apply. And in addition, if I use DirectQuery to connect that SQL Server, since it supports row-level security, you should be able to apply row-level security as well through that. However, as you're probably aware, if I publish it to the service, I've got my on-prem SQL Server, you also need to set up the gateway to set up that secure communication pipe between the service and the SQL Server, so it's able to do those sort of queries and updates and that sort of thing. But row-level security is supported in that instance.
And what if there's existing security groups in your enterprise LDAP/ADS? Is that something that you can map to?
Yes. Yes, you can map to those. If you noticed when I was doing my mapping here, and I started typing, it basically gave me every person, but also every security group and a distribution group that's in our organization. And I was able to choose any of them if there's any that are existing. And if you don't have access to that, like if that's controlled by a different organization and you know, that's not something you want to kind of touch. Like I said, then it gets back to how you're designing your tables here. So you would build all of it into your sort of like security tables that way. And then there'd be much more maintenance, right? Or you would have to do your own maintenance, but you would be able to have your own kind of control over it as opposed to necessarily being reliant on whoever's managing your AD environment. Did I cover most of them, Mike?
Yeah, I think there was another question about the hierarchical table, and I think you talked a little bit
Yeah,
about that.
I
And
talked
then,
a little bit about that one. I probably didn't really show any great examples. That's probably one where I would be happy to follow up with you to talk about your sort of specific question and more, and happy to just have a chat about it, that sort of thing on some of these sort of hierarchy ones because they get very specific to your particular sort of different ways you need to filter it. So it's kind of hard to talk in real generalities, but like I said, the general concept is to make use of that sort of path function or something like that.
yeah, then there's some question about downloading the data. Like if you have a user with viewer access and you allow export, do they get
Yeah,
just their subset of the data?
no, if they actually download the data. That's a good question. I think that's what I would want to follow up and actually test, to tell you the truth. I'm not sure. In theory, if you've got a report here, with my report here, right? In theory, if I've got my report here and you give them on the ability here to say choose, export data, that it would only give the data that they have permissions on. So that should flow through to row level security, but I would want to test it before I said definitively, or I would recommend that you test that to make sure that that works. And you can actually see there's a setting here whether or not you can when you create your report, you actually have a setting here whether or not you can give people just access to the summarized data, which was the data for this visualization, or the underlying records as well.
Great. And then I guess that there's some questions about if you don't have AD, then is there a way to have a group solution that would work across different reports? And I think that's what you're talking about, having that. And it really comes back to having that security table.
Yeah, I guess the other point there is you may not have an enterprise AD, but when you set up your Power BI space, app.powerbi.com for your company, that is tied to behind the scenes Active Directory in some way for people to be logging in. So you would still be managing their logins, and maybe behind the covers, it doesn't feel like AD, and you're just kind of managing at the user level. And like I said, set up your own sort of security tables. But under the covers, like I said, the Power BI service, when a person logs in, it's using that as its authentication mechanism for the person who's logging in. Well, great. I hope everyone has been surviving all of the shelter in place and not getting too stir crazy, and everyone's healthy, most important, and all of your groups and organizations. And like I said, we're here. I'm happy to have follow-up conversations with anyone who wants to talk about them, that sort of thing. And looking forward to it.
Yeah, that sounds great, Steve. If you want to toggle back to the last slide, in that vein, we thank you for joining us today. First of all, thank our presenter, Mr. Wolfschlager, for an excellent presentation. If you do have follow-up questions or want to talk to us about your specific challenges in your environment, please feel free to reach out to us using any of the methods below through our website, through the 888 number, or simply email us at info@senturus.com. And we look forward to seeing you on another one of our Knowledge Series events. Thank you very much. Stay safe and have a great rest of your day. Bye now.